Some of the earliest at-home video games were of the role-playing genre. In a certain respect, they were technical marvels, able to create large and sprawling worlds on incredibly limited resources. Games like Pool of Radiance and Wasteland broke ground in the late 80s and eventually gave way to a slew of first-person adventures such as Eye of the Beholder and Lands of Lore. That trend would largely continue until isometric experiences found in games like Baldur's Gate and Diablo were released as the turn of the millennium neared. Now, I'll be honest, I am not a huge fan of a lot of these older games, though there are some I do like. For the most part, they're just a little too far out of my range for me to get any real nostalgia from them, and quite frankly, I think the way that many games were designed in the late 80s until around the mid-90s were intentionally poor. I mean, a lot of these games featured puzzle solutions that make no sense, insane difficulty spikes at random times, and God knows how many unwinnable situations that served no purpose other than to make a game seem far longer than it actually was by virtue of wasting the player's time. If any modern game employed these sorts of practices, people would be up in arms. In recent years, role-playing games have become much more attached to the roguelike subgenre. For those unaware, a roguelike is essentially any game that features randomly generated variables, being items, levels, and whatever else the game may offer to the player that usually change every single time the player starts up the game. Many of them feature permanent death and intentionally lacking save features. While the definition of what is and isn't a roguelike is the topic of debate, some of the best contemporary examples of these games are Faster Than Light and Risk of Rain. It's certainly a flourishing genre bolstered by insane amounts of replayability and indie support that has seen exponential amounts of success if games like Darkest Dungeon and Hades are any indication. Then again, those games could also be considered roguelike-likes, games with roguelike elements that are not traditional roguelikes, so it's really confusing. But what if I told you that for one game back in 1993, the classic dungeon crawlers of old and the roguelikes of today met in a matrimony that I'm not so sure has been replicated since. Enter Dungeon Hack, developed by Dreamforge and published by SSI. Using one of the old Eye of the Beholder engines, the game takes the player through a number of randomly generated dungeons featuring randomized enemies and items. Unlike other dungeon crawlers, the player only gets one character as opposed to a whole party. You're dropped into a dungeon alone with a bunch of monsters, and you've got to fight your way through and adapt to whatever the game does, or doesn't, give you. The game plays off what I'll very generously call a loose adaptation of 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons. Leading up to the release, SSI claimed the game had over 4 billion different dungeons that it could create. I sincerely doubt the actual number is truly so high, but I can say that over numerous playthroughs I've never seen the same floor twice. The levels are mostly catacombs and caves, with an occasional castle-like location thrown in. Every level is an absolute labyrinth featuring pitfalls, illusionary walls, and teleporters that the player must navigate through while collecting keys and other items to progress onward. Each floor is crawling, and I do mean absolutely crawling, with enemies, of which there are typically 2 types per area. When killed, enemies award loot and experience, and occasionally items that are required for progression, forcing the player to parlay even if they might prefer not to. The enemies are pretty standard fare for D&D. Lesser monsters like orcs and goblins will make up the lion's share of what you'll face in the early levels as you work your way up to foes such as dragons. Most of them are very faithful to their source material, meaning that you'll want to adapt accordingly to whatever you're locked in combat with. Best not to look a Medusa in the eye or engage in melee with a wight, if you catch my drift. Numerical values for enemies are randomly generated, meaning you can't get complacent. One enemy may die in a single hit, whereas another will take several and send you running for the hills. To traverse these levels, the player has the option of creating their own character or choosing from a number of pre-generated ones. The game features just about every class available in 2nd edition, except druids for some reason. Literally, unless I'm going blind, it's the only class that isn't here. The boys back at Dreamforge hated touching grass, clearly. Also, the game lets the player roll for stats, but I'm not really sure why. Like, you can roll, sure, but the game just literally lets you raise and lower stats all you want. In fact, the game actually lets the player customize their experience far beyond that of most. It has standard difficulty settings, but the player is free to customize any number of different variables as they see fit. You can adjust the frequency and strength of just about everything that appears in the game, as well as opting for or against roguelike staples like permanent character death. I think this is a really underrated part of the game, actually. If there's something you don't enjoy, you're free to just remove it. The game keeps track of the enemies you've slain over the course of a run, as well as a list of your previous playthroughs. Though I don't think I've played any seeds that warrant it, it does give you the code of the world to share with others, and seeing the code change in real time as you adjust difficulty settings is worryingly entertaining to me. Oh, and if I forgot to mention, there is no story. Like, none. I'm not sure what the point of the game's opening cutscene is, because there is nothing here. The game doesn't have any music either, though in all fairness, this is a product of when the game was made, but I still can't shake how weird it feels to play in relative silence for large portions of time. In comparison to the other games that were released around the same time, I think it's modern enough to still be worth playing today. It has a map feature, as well as enough quality of life aspects such as a massive inventory, and enough player feedback to prevent you from getting unnecessarily stuck. That's not to say it's all perfect, though. Some enemies present challenges that the player has no way of meeting, such as the wights I mentioned earlier. They have a chance to drain you of a level every time they land a hit, and Restoration is a 7th level spell, realistically meaning unless you're a 14th level cleric, any floor featuring them can be a tedious slog of saving and reloading because levels are just that important. Also, for as good as the player feedback is in a lot of situations, such as your character telling you whenever they've entered a specific magical zone, or the many notes that provide tips and tricks, one place where this feedback is severely lacking is with the illusionary walls. Outside of the use of true seeing, you can only find the illusions by literally walking through them, meaning that it's basically guaranteed at some point you're going to stare at a level with seemingly no way forward and have to resort to slamming yourself against every wall until you find the fake one. And unfortunately, there aren't any figures for weapon damage or spell effects in the game either, instead being limited to the manual. However, the good old games version comes with said manual, not to mention that it's pretty available online, so it's not really much of a problem. The manual is basically a game guide, which, I have to admit, is pretty neat. If you want some tips for your first adventure, because I know you're all here for the hot details on the dungeon hack meta, I mean, just play a cleric. You're stuck in a long dungeon with limited resources and amazingly, the one class with any real healing capabilities is quite a bit better than the others. Clerics also get access to the spell Spiritual Hammer, which simply has no business being as good as it is, considering it's cast at 2nd level. That being said, every class can succeed in completing the dungeon, and there are enough multi-class options to make up for some class weaknesses. No matter what class you choose, you're going to die, whether it be due to the enemies you face, traps, or the fact that you're going to have to get used to the patented wonderful controls of days past. Even the best runs feature a floor that absolutely breaks your back. And remember, unlike most other roguelikes, this game is not particularly fast-paced, so if you're dealing with a rough floor, buckle in. You'll be cringing every time you come across an enemy. It's still pretty surprising to me that a game that I'm fairly certain was devised as a cash grab that let them recycle an existing engine ended up being sort of a peek into the future as roguelikes would eventually become more popular. And it blows my mind that this is still the only true D&D roguelike released to date. It's not a flawless experience, but it is a sincerely interesting meeting of two different genres from two completely different eras. And regardless of where you purchase it from, it's dirt cheap, so I'm hard-pressed to find reasons as to why you shouldn't give it a try. Just remember to bang yourself against every wall you see, you know, for good measure.
The adventure is over! Look at all this treasure! My adventure has just begun.